Tonight we're going to be discussing too many choices. I'm Justin, and welcome to a Wicked Parley. Now, you might ask yourself, what's better than having endless options? Is endless options even a good thing? Well, I would say that it leads to too many choices, and I think that's a problem. Now, you might think to yourself, well, why could having too many choices be a problem? Well, there's many reasons for why this is. The first reason that really comes to mind is the fact that if you have so many choices, how do you ever know if you're making the right decision? Wouldn't you constantly be second guessing yourself? I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but I know in my own personal experience that actually seems to be the case. When I was first going to college, I took a test. That test said if you did the job on the test, it would tell you everything you needed to know about any profession that you would be qualified to do, that you would find actually enjoyable. And it used a Myers-Briggs style format to come to these particular conclusions. The conclusion I got was something that I was not prepared for. It actually listed far more job professions than virtually any other option that I'd ever been exposed to. I was expecting to see maybe 20 or 30 jobs. I got well over 200. And that made choosing a career using this particular method kind of difficult because I constantly had to second guess, well, is this really what I want? What makes this job better than the other? And that's just one example of how too many choices can be kind of an issue. Another example is, have you ever gone into the grocery store when you're hungry? Have you ever kind of walked in the door and realized, wow, there's just everything in here so good. How can I ever make a good decision here? Do I just stick to all the outer sides and never go inside? But then you go inside and you get a box, something that you probably shouldn't have gotten. Maybe it's brownies. Maybe it's Pop-Tarts. Maybe it's those little donut things that you shouldn't have, but you do have. Is it because there's too many choices? Perhaps. Now, I'm sure we can all gather why exactly is too much choice a problem. At least this can point to the beginning of this particular discussion. I want to discuss what's it like for a person who maybe chose the wrong thing. Now, a person who is 10, 15, 16 options isn't going to necessarily know that they chose the right thing outright, because how would you know 100%? Well, if you're constantly self-doubting and you're constantly thinking, well, this is not what I want, then maybe you made the wrong choice, and that's just obvious based upon the feelings. But maybe it's not so obvious for some people. Maybe some people have a harder time being able to explain that to someone else or even themselves, come to terms with it. Maybe it takes years. Well, that's kind of a problem now, wouldn't you say? The main thing that I think is most important to discuss from all this stuff has to do with what's the sweet spot. What's the right spot of how many choices do you need to have in order to feel like you're actually choosing what's going on? You have some sort of autonomy in your life. And what's the amount that becomes too much? Because clearly if you have 50, 100, 200 choices, it's too much. It's obviously too much. And I think that's going to depend upon the individual. It's not like a hard, this is exactly it. This could be kind of like a rubric or a guideline for what could be right. Now, psychologists have said for a pretty long time that a variety of choices can be detrimental to a person's success because it can create circumstances by which a person will experience anxiety and confusion and depression. And they found that people who had a limited pool of choices typically exhibited fewer responses in this particular way. The number of choices that we're given typically is that when any time you exceed the number of 3, you typically find that it's considered you have some autonomy. If you have fewer than 3, then you have none. And so the sweet spot is somewhere between 4 and 5 choices. Whenever you go to make a decision, if you have 4 or 5 options, you feel like you have some say in what's going on in your life. But it's not so much that you can't clearly look a little bit down the road to kind of predict maybe what might happen if you take these actions. So you can have the level of control that a person might feel comfortable with. Now, that's not going to be true for everybody, as I've mentioned before, but it's kind of, this is a guideline. Now, when it becomes extreme, isn't so clear, but I think it's pretty easy to say that if you get to about 15 choices, it becomes a lot harder to narrow it down. 15 isn't just some arbitrary number either. So other people who have looked into this have actually found that that number, or a number close to it, is relatively where this kind of begins at the uncomfortable uncertainty spectrum. And of course it exponentially increases with the number of choices that are provided to you. Now you may ask, okay, I have all these choices, I can't slim them down, what do I do? There are a few things that come to mind. The first is you could write them all down. And then, once you've written them all down, reorder them by priority. So let's say hypothetically you have a dozen things to do in the day, and maybe you know that 6 of these things absolutely need to get done. Maybe you have kids, maybe you need to pick them up from school. Maybe you have to, make sure that the car gets cleaned, so you gotta take it to the car wash. Maybe you got some groceries to pick up. Maybe you have a job to go work. Whatever those lists might be. But clearly some of those things are a little more important. Like, I don't know, picking up your kids from school, after work, going to work, getting food for yourself. Maybe the car wash doesn't necessarily need to happen. Maybe the dog groomer can wait. And so by ordering what's most important, you can narrow down the number of things you have to do, which can then help you make better decisions. And that's just one example using something like that. Let's say you use the grocery example that I had used earlier. You go into a grocery store, you're hungry, you have all these choices in the world. Maybe it's too much. But let's say you change that. Flip the script a little bit. Instead, you go into the grocery store with a list. You go, these are the things that I know for a fact that I will eat that'll get me by for however long it is until I need to go to the grocery store again. And you go on that list and you grab everything on that list. Well, now you've got everything on the list, and it kind of targets what you're going to get while you're at the store. By creating these little cheats and focusing on one thing, it can help strengthen your resolve, carry you through the various decision makings that you need to do, and give you a level of autonomy, but also narrow down the scope so that way you don't get overwhelmed by all of the options. There are other examples that can be said, but I think you guys are starting to get the picture. The key thing when it comes to dealing with too many problems has nothing to do with the number of problems that are presented, because you live in a world with infinite possibilities, even if it seems like you don't in some circumstances. The way you have to be able to adjust is to guarantee that you focus on the things that matter most. And by doing that, you can narrow the focus, limit the number of choices that you are choosing to make or choose from, and in that way, you won't have too many choices. Hopefully, that idea has been a little helpful for you guys. I'd like to thank you guys all for hearing a little bit of a rant about me talking about too many choices. Hopefully, you guys were able to take a message from that was educational and fun, or at least consider something different. And we got those choices. I hope you guys all have a great and wonderful night, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Good night, everybody.